Not backing down, hundreds of thousands of Romanians call for the government to resign, despite the Prime Minister caving into initial demands. Will the people's will win? Also on today's program, transformation at last. Somalia is set to elect a new president. Can they overcome decades of instability? We speak with a top government minister. And an Everest expedition with a twist. Scientists are trying to figure out if the roof of the world is still as high as we think it is. I'm Imran Garta, and this is the Newsmakers. It's hard to imagine a rockier start to a new government. Less than 5 weeks in power, Romania's ruling coalition has prompted the country's biggest protests since the fall of communism almost 3 decades ago. 500,000 people filled the streets on Sunday calling for the government to resign. The response was sparked by a decree which would have watered down anti-corruption laws. You could avoid jail time if your offence totaled less than $50,000. The government said it was meant to relieve pressure on overcrowded prisons. But critics point out it would have protected some of the ruling party's politicians from prosecution. Well, after a week of mass rallies, the government gave in, scrapping the decree. But is their U-turn enough to placate protesters? Our newsmakers today are Romania's demonstrators as we ask if people power can force the government out of office.
At this moment, I no longer trust my government.
We want our government to resign.
Romania's anti-government protests are only growing.
Nu doresc să dezbinăm România. România nu poate fi ruptă în două.
Despite Prime Minister Sorin Grindeanu's promise to rescind an emergency decree that critics say would have pardoned ruling party officials caught in an anti-corruption drive. The government says it has now scrapped the decree completely. It has not only sent shockwaves across Romania, but has rung alarm bells at the EU 10 years after Romania joined the bloc.
The emergency ordinance and the draft legislation pertaining to the fight against corruption cannot be interpreted as anything else than a step back.
On the 6th day of protests, thousands held their cell phone lights skyward in Victory Square in Bucharest. Some say they were the largest protests in almost 30 years, since the country's 1989 revolution, which overthrew communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, Romania, like many ex-communist states, has struggled with endemic corruption. But in the last few years, there's been progress at rooting out corrupt officials. Adrian Năstase, a former prime minister, was jailed in 2012. A second, Victor Ponta, resigned in 2015 after facing corruption charges. Last year, President Klaus Iohannis, who has joined the current protests, set up an anti-graft commission which advanced the prosecution of 777 indicted defendants, including ministers, MPs, and judges. Many of those affected were linked to the center-left Social Democrat Party, or PSD, which returned to power in January after winning a vote of confidence. The PSD claims that by targeting more officials from its party than ever before, the Anti-Corruption Commission was biased. It's clear people have now taken matters into their own hands. It seems public trust in Romania's ruling elite has worn thin, with many now convinced a people's purge is the only way forward. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
To discuss this, I'm joined by political analyst Radu Magdin. He was an advisor to the former Prime Minister Victor Ponta. And from Victory Square in Bucharest, Laura Ștefan. She's a former director in the Romanian Ministry of Justice and an expert on the rule of law with the European Commission and the Council of Europe. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Let me start with you, Laura Ștefan. What were they thinking? What was the government thinking in the first place by introducing this law? Did they completely misjudge the possible ramifications?
I mean, this is really hard to say from an outsider perspective. I wonder myself what were they thinking and how come they did not project what the reaction, what the counter reaction is going to be. It's really sad to see how the government fails to understand, even today, the importance of transparency and how things need to be regulated in this country. Adopting legislation late in the evening, when you already have indication of the rejection by the society of that legislation, to me it's hard to understand. And also it comes as a shock to me that a center-left party like PSD considers the possibility of introducing an amendment that basically decriminalizes abuse in office up to 50,000 euros. I mean, this is a lot of money for many Romanians, money that people don't make in a lifetime. So yes, what were they thinking?
So Radu, is that because they're all dirty, whether they're on the left or the right? That's why these politicians want to protect their interests?
I wouldn't generalize. I've met in my life a lot of political Romanian politicians, whether at the national, local or international level, and the truth is they're not all the same. Unfortunately, for the moment, the ones who may be more in charge and driving this process clearly feel they may be vulnerable to the judicial process. I think, first of all, they did misstep from a political strategy point of view. Not to mention things on the merits. I think that Laura is much better than me on judicial aspects, so I'll not get into this. From a political point of view, they thought that once they have a strong political majority, they could get away with it. First of all, because the truth is in Parliament, our opposition right now is not necessarily very strong. I would say they misjudged President Iohannis as well, because the president managed to, I would say, make quite a bit of a communications and political barrage against them the past few days. So clearly protests are over the country right now. You know the situation. I think it's going to continue for a while, simply because the government is for the moment not credible in promising less than what they did.
So you say the government's not credible and it doesn't live up to its promises. Is the government in trouble? Is the Prime Minister's position in trouble as a result of this people power, with more than 500,000 people taking to the streets and people still insisting on demonstrating, even if on the surface of things the government has caved into their demands?
The problem is not the Prime Minister's person per se. I don't think that people in Romania actually believe the current Prime Minister is the main person in power and the main stakeholder within the PSD or the PSD-ALDE parliamentary majority. So I think that he's, from this perspective, let's say he's a secondary character in this drama. I think that the PSD leader, Liviu Dragnea, clearly has made a lot of fans. The Justice Minister, Mr. Iordache, who was, I would say, even worse at communications than on things on the merits, was quite surprising for us all. But I don't believe that people, right now, looking at the state of the opposition or the various other stakeholders, the country is ready for snap elections. First of all, it would be really weird, where we have just had parliamentary elections. Second of all, I believe that if the street demands snap elections, quite the contrary, we will see counter manifestations, simply because the government in power, while the majority in power, while losing some political support, they're still strong in the country.
Mm-hmm. We wanted to get the government on the program. We wanted them to speak for themselves, but they didn't want to come on the program. They directed us to their earlier statements, and particularly the Prime Minister's call for unity. I just want to dip into that for the moment, because the Prime Minister seemed to blame the Justice Minister for bad messaging as the main reason for the chaos. He said, I think it is important to mention one more thing, namely all the arguments we had in supporting this ordinance were not very well communicated. For this reason, a lot of confusion was created, very many distortions that are not related to what was adopted in the end. For this reason, the Justice Ministry and the Justice Minister will assume and currently assume all consequences. Laura, is that fair, or is that throwing the Justice Minister under the bus when it wasn't necessarily his fault?
I think you touched upon an essential issue here, which is the issue of trust. People lost trust in the government. That's the underlying problem here, and how you solve that, this is a $1 million question. The Minister of Justice really managed the crisis very badly. I would add by saying that he generated this crisis to begin with. It was his initiative to table these acts at the government meeting. I don't agree that this is just a communication issue. It's also the way of doing business for this government, which really brought people to the streets. It is unacceptable to first write secretly laws and regulations, then try to adopt it overnight secretly again in a government meeting without announcing them previously, without publishing them for public review. And then a week later, again saying that the government is meeting for the budget, to discuss the budget. We discover at the late hours of the evening that one of the emergency ordinances has passed. And then the Minister of Justice holds a press conference, which really is impossible to describe. Very aggressive, very cynical. It's not just an attitude issue, it's also how the government decided to operate, to conduct its daily business. And still, we have the same Justice Minister today. I mean, I'm not quite sure what the Prime Minister expects us to understand from this vague formulation that people are going to assume responsibility. He just asked the Minister of Justice to do a self-evaluation for himself. I mean, we're hiding behind words here. They have generated a crisis. They waited many, many days before they came out with a solution for this crisis, and now they complain that nobody trusts them anymore. I feel as if we are really discussing without understanding what each of the sides are saying.
Laura, as we look sort of across the continent and reading about Romania, seeing that the National Anti-Corruption Department, the DNA, was created as a condition of EU accession. With all of that in mind, how do all these recent events square with being an EU member state, and is it somewhat embarrassing for Romania?
It is embarrassing for Romania, not only from a European perspective, but also from a national perspective. And I think this is what the people in Romania are saying today, that we had enough, and you cannot just change criminal laws without discussing with people. We are, as you know, under a cooperation and verification mechanism. It's only Romania and Bulgaria that have such type of oversight from the European Commission. They've just issued a very positive report on Romania, basically opening a door for a closure of the mechanism. But because the rumors about these emergency ordinances emerged just before the adoption of the report, they put in language there saying that if disasters happen, of course they will reevaluate their evaluation. And surprise, surprise, this is what Romania keeps on persevering to show to Europe, that unfortunately we cannot be trusted and that reforms are not irreversible.
Radu, are we seeing a battle between two Romanias or two ideas of what it means to be a Romanian democracy, with maybe one camp wanting to be a liberal, transparent democracy and another camp wanting to be more akin to, say, a Hungary-type country?
I think that people are after this kind of polarization. I'm not sure that is necessarily true. I think we should go over this campaigning mode that we had last year. So I think it's easy to simplify in terms of political terms, but the truth is there is not, I believe, a gap in between voters as regards the preference as regards integrity or honesty. I think that the PSD will have problems with its own electorate in the days and weeks to come. I think they're already showing some shortages in terms of polls, simply because the main idea is to be who's more competent and who's doing more things for the country. The PSD was better than the right-wing parties last December in basically saying that they're going to increase salaries, increase pensions. Some people may call this populist, some other people may call this caring politics. That's an issue of option and perspective. But right now, this axis in between who goes for integrity and who doesn't is clearly against the government, and I believe there is a wider union right now in Romania in between leftists and right-wingers who all claim integrity is important.
Laura, short of calling snap elections, what can the government do to get people off the streets and back to work and happy with who's in charge of them?
It's hard to say what would please the people in the streets today, just because the solution to the crisis was very much protracted, and people perceived the government as trying to get away with it. It's hard to say what would bring them inside their homes and to their normal life again. But if I would be to make one advice to this government, it would be definitely to find someone credible for the justice portfolio and try to behave when it comes to amendments to legislation and to institutional frameworks in this country. That doesn't mean that justice is a taboo subject in Romania. We are, of course, free to discuss about good parts and challenges, but that doesn't mean adopting legislation in the middle of the night.
Laura and Radu, it's been great to talk to both of you. Thanks so much for joining us. If Romania has a corruption problem, well, it pales in comparison to Somalia's. The conflict-torn country consistently competes with North Korea for last place on corruption index lists. Somalia has been without an effective government for decades, but there are hopes those days are numbered. The country is set to elect a new president this week. It's being seen as a crucial moment in the country's troubled transition to democracy. But in the face of extreme poverty, shaky security and famine, will any of the candidates be able to usher in a new era of stability? Natalie Pahernan reports.
In the run-up to presidential elections, Somalia has been rocked by violence. This attack took place last month at a hotel near the Parliament building in Mogadishu. At least 28 people died, adding to the death toll of the decade-long insurgency waged by Al-Shabaab. The armed group was forced out of the capital in 2011 by a joint Somali military and African Union peacekeeping force, AMISOM. The government continues to rely on about 22,000 of its soldiers and police to stabilise the country. But this hasn't stopped Al-Shabaab from continuing to attack government buildings, peacekeeping stations and civilians. And it's amidst this backdrop that the nation has been taking tentative steps towards democracy, more than 2 decades after civil war erupted in 1991 and fractured the country.
Somalia cannot hide from or wish away their difficult past, as it clearly have impacted on us all heavily, but there is no denying our collective ambition to never return to it.
Somalia is home to about 11 million people, but only a fraction of them took part in last year's parliamentary elections. Clan chiefs selected the 14,000 people to vote for the 329 members of the upper and lower houses. That process didn't go through without controversy. The UN, AU and EU issued a joint statement to raise concerns about egregious cases of abuse of the electoral process, including seats reserved for women candidates only, ultimately taken by male candidates. Despite this, there is optimism about what the new government can do for Somalis.
The new parliament is younger, more diverse, and likely to be more responsive to the electorate than the previous one. In short, this parliament is more legitimate and representative than any since the last elections were held in 1969.
This week, MPs are due to decide who will be the next Somali president, and whether incumbent Hassan Sheikh Mohammed will be given another 4-year term. A major step for the nation's delicate democracy. Natalie Pahernan, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Mogadishu is Abdurrahman Yusuf Hussein Ainti. He is the Minister of Planning and International Cooperation in the Somali government. Minister, thanks so much for joining us. Big day on Wednesday, presidential election. How high are the stakes for your country?
Very high. We don't have presidential elections very often, once every 4 years or so. And this is going to be a major change in the way we handle elections. These elections have been a lot more different than previous elections in that a lot more people have participated in the electoral process. We used to have an election where few people essentially decided who was going to be the leader of this country. But now we've had about 20,000 people or so elect a bicameral legislature who are now electing the president.
I'm looking at some of the problems of Somalia, and my apologies, there are so many to choose from here. it's a shaky, fragile situation politically for your country. So you have Al-Shabaab attacks, you have a strange and sometimes difficult relationship with AMISOM. There's a security threat for locals and foreigners alike. What do you think is the biggest problem that needs to be fixed and can be fixed by a new president putting it at the top of his agenda?
Certainly, security comes at the top of the agenda. We've had an improved security overall, I would say, in the past 4 years. But at the same time, I think most Somalis would be critical if they hear me say this, because they feel every day that insecurity has increased in some parts of the country, especially in Mogadishu. So putting together a very competent security apparatus and also restoring security in many parts of the country, as well as at least if not eliminating, decreasing the number of major terrorist attacks by Al-Shabaab and other groups would be a top priority.
What are you most proud of over the past 4.5 years?
Well, certainly a lot has been achieved in the last 4.5 years. One of the, I believe, major achievements is that we've been able to tackle some of the key issues of creating a federal structure for the country. 4.5 years ago, there was only one federal member state. Today, we have 5 federal member states in our new federal architecture. That's an achievement in and of itself. The second one is that we've been able to articulate a kind of an economic recovery plan for the next 3 years, that we've just finalized our first national development plan in 3 years. We've also been able to review our constitution, although that's an ongoing process. And of course, even though we have fallen short of holding one person, one vote elections, we've been able to add some 20,000 people into our electoral system. So these are some of the few achievements. But of course, we could have done a lot better than we've actually done in the last 4 years.
Can your country ever be fully independent, fully free, as long as it's dependent in so many ways on those AMISOM troops?
Actually, next month will mark the 10th anniversary of the African Union peacekeeping mission in Somalia. And there is now an increased debate within Somalia, within policymakers, to try and see how we can essentially untangle ourselves from what is now increasingly looks like an over-reliance on external security forces. Critics would be legitimate to say that we could have charted a different path over the past 4 years.
You mentioned that there are so many candidates in the presidential election. Does that make Wednesday's vote all the more unpredictable?
Certainly. I mean, there are 24 men running for the top seat of the country. Very few have a realistic chance of actually making it to the top. It is a very competitive electoral election that we're going to have on Wednesday. And, one has to look at these things in context. We live in one of the most undemocratic regions in the world. The Horn of Africa is not a very democratic region. So, in a way, Somalis feel proud of, some of our, rudimentary democratic credentials. Not as good and as transparent and as clean as one would have liked, but certainly a lot better than a lot of the neighboring countries, for example.
Now, Minister, we first encountered each other when you were donning a different hat, when you were a journalist, and you wrote very well over the years. I would follow a lot of your writing. In 2012, you wrote about the Somali presidential elections then, and you said, Somali presidential elections, 6 ways to win power. And you said, base support, money, political network, external support, name recognition, and a presence in Somalia. And in your final line was interesting, because you said, the archaic, clannish way of seeking the presidency, while still omnipresent, is beginning to lose momentum. The next election, just 5 short years away, i.e. now, will hopefully be a lot more vibrant and far less clan-oriented. So I ask you, 5 years later, do you feel that that is the case?
Well, certainly, I did not have, the good foresight that I should have had, but clearly we have made a major progress in terms of leaving some of our traditional ways of elections. Certainly, the issue of clan and tribe continues to play a major role in our political system. but not as omnipresent as it used to be a few years ago. And we now have a very clear plan that in 4 years' time, political parties will play a lot bigger role than they do play right now. And so we're leaving some of our legacy behind, but we're also now kind of climbing through the ropes, learning new tactics to our political system.
Minister Abdi, it's been great talking to you. Thanks so much for taking the time. In today's Picture This, a group of 30 Indian scientists face a mountain of a task. This is why. Let's take a look. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.